You are listening to Hunted by A.D. Lamar. Creative Commons. Copyright 2024 by A.D. Lamar. Sharing this recording is permitted with credit to the author. Chapter 1. It was an overcast day in the Chinese city of Changchun. At the University of Technology, a weathered concrete parade square was festooned with banners and flags representing the university drill team, the war flag of the People's Liberation Army, and the national flag of the People's Republic of China. Several dozen folding chairs were positioned under a wooden three-sided shelter, and all but the front 5 were filled with officers of the PLA, along with several local members of the Chinese Communist Party. 2 glossy black staff cars silently rolled up to the wooden shelter, and the doors of each opened in unison. Major General Zhang Shizhong allowed his driver to open the door of the expensive Hongqi L5 and stepped out into the cool April weather. The heavy woolen tunic of his uniform was not the only insulation he possessed. He also had a thick belly that protruded in front of him, the product of a lifetime of enjoying the best food that his wealth and influence could afford. The second vehicle was a standard nondescript black staff car, and the rear door opened as Lieutenant General Ling Xiaoping stepped out. He tapped on the passenger window and nodded at the driver before quickening his pace to catch up to his fatter and slower compatriot, who was waddling to the nearest door of the university building. Xiaoping was tall and thin, and had risen through the ranks through hard work and a little bit of luck. He had no need for the finer things in life, taking pleasure instead from the honor of his work serving the people of China. He quickly outpaced Shizhong and arrived at the door first, turning to stare laconically at the sweaty-faced staff officer who was doing his best to hide the effort of trying to keep up. 3 days ago, he had received an actual written letter from a senior party official, inviting him to a demonstration of a new technology that would assist the country in defeating their enemies. The 4-page letter had been curiously light on details, except for the time and location of the test. Xiaoping was the Quartermaster General of the People's Army, which put him in charge of observing and testing new equipment for China's armed forces. Normally, his job was nothing more than rubber-stamping the latest acquisition and overseeing the many billions of dollars of hardware, weapons, and vehicles forming the vast inventory of his country's growing military might. A personal invitation was highly irregular, and such a request could only mean that this technology was highly secretive in nature. It was undeniably exciting, and Xiaoping was in a good mood. Xiaoping waited at the door, turning to acknowledge the other general who was a newly promoted party member, not a hardened soldier who rose to his position through hard work. He could not openly show his contempt for the man, but he wasn't about to give him any extra respect either. Shizhong did not even acknowledge his superior as he arrived at the door, already showing several tiny beads of sweat on his forehead. The door was steel-clad and looked heavy, with not just 1 but 2 card scanners and a pair of armed guards posted 24 hours a day. Both generals retrieved their scan cards and swiped them at the same moment. The darkness inside the building spilled out into the early afternoon light, and the noise of marching university students faded as they entered the complex. A painfully thin civilian with deep hollows under his eyes and a permanent hunch was waiting to guide the 2 generals into the bowels of the University of Technology Research Wing, which had been completely isolated from the rest of the campus by several layers of strong security. Xiaoping felt a cold draft of air pass by and suppressed a shudder. This was a sinister place, and he imagined he could feel evil spirits lurking around every poorly lit corner. His initial feeling of delight and anticipation was beginning to sour, but there was nothing to be done about that. The hunchback said nothing, leading the way through a twist of corridors to another security checkpoint. A floor-to-ceiling wire mesh gate prevented access to what must have been the very center of the wing, and another 2 guards were positioned there. This time, the civilian himself scanned the card reader, and they proceeded into a hallway that had once been a row of classrooms, but was now converted into a poorly ventilated and dimly lit laboratory. Xiaoping saw everything and remembered nearly every detail. As a young officer 25 years ago, he had honed the skill of observation and could build a detailed map of an interior building from memory even after just 1 visit. He calculated that they had about 100 meters of building between themselves and the outside world, a formidable barrier against enemy intrusion. They walked by 4 of the doors, the only sound being the wheezing of Shizhong, who was clearly unaccustomed to this much walking. Qiaoping wondered again who had decided to invite this worthless officer, but such decisions were made at a level far beyond even his significant authority. A man such as this was useless as a military officer, but he had access to people who could get things done, fast-track approvals, and money. So his presence here might be even more important than his own. The hunchback civilian stopped in front of the only door that was currently manned by an armed security officer, who immediately came to attention in the presence of the generals. The security man stepped back to give access to the card reader, which had a stark red light emanating into the dim glow of the hallway. Qiaoping felt another breeze on his neck and glanced up to see a ventilation shaft directly above his head. The opening of the shaft was quite large, big enough for a man to fit through. The cover of the shaft was flimsy plastic, basically no barrier at all. He pictured for a second how he would grasp the edges and thrust himself inside, moving through the dark interior to escape the building. Interesting. He followed the small group of men through the doorway into what had been a classroom but was now converted into a testing center. As he walked through the doorway, he thought he saw a flash of light from the corner of his vision, and he definitely heard a light buzzing that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. Wires and cables were strewn all over, with cameras and sensors mounted on the counters, walls, and even the ceiling. Several figures were scurrying around, completely covered in white protective suits, and Qiaoping could see that there were radiation hazard symbols on some of the suits and equipment. Several more strange flashes of light, this time from both of his eyes. He blinked rapidly and saw that Shizhong was rubbing his meaty hands against his eyes vigorously. The hunchback spoke in a gravelly voice. "Please do not be concerned, generals. The radiation is not dangerous for visitors." He opened up a plastic case and retrieved several pairs of what appeared to be thick sunglasses, handing them to the 2 staff officers. "You may see flashes of light, that is normal. Harmless stray particles are hitting your optic nerve, but these glasses will block them." Qiaoping grabbed the offered glasses and put them over his eyes quickly. The assurances of the hunchbacked man were not convincing, and he wanted to get this over as soon as possible. Was radiation usually visible as flashes of light? Qiaoping didn't think so, because there was radiation all around you, all the time. This must be something entirely different, a form of radiation with unknown effects. Shizhong evidently felt the same way, for he grabbed the hunchback by the upper arm and said, "This is taking too long. We need to see a demonstration right away," he exclaimed. But while he said it, he was looking at Qiaoping. Qiaoping said nothing, but when the hunchback old man turned to look at him, he nodded and gestured his assent. The hunchback nodded and walked over to a black box that appeared to be surrounded by metal mesh. Qiaoping thought this looked like a Faraday cage, a setup designed to block or reflect radio transmissions and electrical signals. 2 switches were flipped up and a small door opened on the front of the box. Inside was a small black device about the size and shape of a cell phone. When the hunchback donned thick gloves and removed the device, Qiaoping saw that it was in fact a cell phone. The phone screen was unlit, but Qiaoping knew that some dark and sinister energy was stirring within the innocent-looking device, and he felt real fear shudder through him like a wave, as though an evil spirit resided in the small device. He was not a superstitious person like many Chinese, but he knew that there were spirits, both good and bad, all around them. This was definitely a bad spirit, and he wished for the first time that he could have declined the summons or sent someone else in his place. He whispered a soundless prayer in his mind without letting his lips move. The room was poorly lit, the overhead lights having been removed to access the power cables and provide more electricity. Small pools of dim light revealed that the room contained a few tables, at least 2 or 3 computer stations with workers manning them, and a chair bolted to the floor in the center of the space. A shadowy form sat in the chair, all but invisible. It was a person, sitting motionless, but nothing else could be seen. "If it pleases the general, take this in your hands." The hunchbacked scientist was offering the cell phone to General Shizhong, who was sweating even worse despite the cool temperature of the air around them. His eyes bulged from his head, and he had both hands raised in a warding gesture as he shuffled backward. "No, it is not for me, you fool!" His voice pierced through the room, and Xiaoping could see the faces of the half-dozen technicians as they turned to watch the new visitors. This was unacceptable. No officer should ever behave in such a way, particularly a general. And Xiaoping felt anger rise in him at the humiliation of seeing his subordinate shouting at a scientist. "Sir?" His voice was sharp and loud, cutting through the murmurs that had started to rise in the room. He carefully kept a neutral expression as he approached the hunchback, holding his hand out. Shizhong avoided his eyes, but Xiaoping could see a smirk across the man's lips. A better officer would have demanded to place himself in potential danger rather than let his boss be exposed. But there were no better men to be found in this place. Taking risks was part of his job, and besides, the consequences of injuring or killing a general as part of a test would mean certain execution for every person in the room. It had to be safe, or they would not have brought them to this place. The cell phone felt perfectly normal. No heavier or lighter than his own, its surface clean and polished as though it had just come from the box. Xiaoping was careful not to push any of the several buttons that stuck out from the sides, instead cautiously cradling the device in his palm. The hunchback man's hollow eyes became much wider, and a grin spread across his creased face. Xiaoping saw him nod furtively to Shizhong, whose face was now plastered with a maddening smirk. Did these two know each other already? He had no time to ponder this, for the device that was sitting in his open hand felt like a grenade with the pin pulled out. "Please do not press any of the buttons, General." That sounded like wise advice, and Xiaoping was already heeding it, holding his hand palm up with the device resting on his palm. The rest of the men in the room stared at him, some of them appearing eager, but some also looked afraid, and that was less encouraging. It took several minutes for the hunchback to poke around his lair, flipping switches and turning on a few more lights. A small lamp brightened above the chair that was in the center of the room, and now they could see that it was a man, a prisoner, with his hands fastened to the metal chair arms with leather straps. The prisoner looked to be a younger man, perhaps early 20s, dressed in a pale blue jumpsuit that was opened at the front. A nest of wires was attached to small white circles on the man's bare chest, leading to the only machine in this room that Xiaoping could identify, an EKG. A white-suited technician shuffled over and plucked the wires from the prisoner's chest. He then loosened one of the prisoner's arms, allowing the man some freedom of movement. The prisoner grimaced and rotated his shoulder, apparently having been restrained for some time. Xiaoping felt some anger rise in him at the thought of mistreatment of a prisoner. No matter what this man had done, keeping him strapped to a chair for hours at a time was barbaric and dishonorable. Hunchback wasn't finished handing out cell phones, and he unceremoniously seized the prisoner's hand, placing another identical device into the man's palm. The prisoner stared at the black rectangle of glass uncomprehendingly. Xiaoping was equally confused, and he looked again at his own device, expecting something to happen. Nothing did for the moment, but the prisoner did briefly lock eyes with the general. Xiaoping sensed the man's apprehension and knew in his soul that this man was a political prisoner, not a violent criminal. There were hundreds of thousands of such men and women moldering in camps and buildings all over China, and now Taiwan after the successful invasion the previous year. "General, may you press the button at your pleasure?" A young man with a bunny hood and anti-static suit was standing at his side, pointing at a small button along the top of the cell phone. The tone and language of the request were so polite that it was almost irritating, the type of request that a toddler would make to their father. The young man was clearly afraid of the next steps that needed to be taken. Xiaoping saw that the hunchback scientist was holding the prisoner's hand, pushing the button on the second phone. The tiny screen lit up completely white, and the prisoner stiffened briefly, then relaxed, staring at the device. Xiaoping did not want to push the button, but his hand moved on its own, tracing up the smooth sides of the device and sensing the raised edges of the small button. Stop. He commanded his fingers to pull back. They disobeyed him, and the smooth, almost imperceptible feeling of the button moving down transmitted up his index finger. Xiaoping felt the tension rise in his body, but nothing happened. The screen flared to life, almost painfully bright, but he could still see the rest of the room just as it was, dimly lit, with the half-dozen men standing around them. He glanced at the chair and his blood ran cold. Weapon! His brain flashed a warning before his eyes could even detect the threat. The prisoner was still seated in the chair, but the restraints were gone. Where the cell phone had been a moment earlier, a glittering knife blade protruded from the man's hand. Xiaoping felt the dump of adrenaline into his body, and his hands came up in a defensive posture. The only object that he had was the cell phone, an object that was clearly useless against a knife. His eyes cast about, and in less than 1/10 of a second, he spotted another identical knife, sitting on a tray within arm's reach. Without hesitation, he reached out and seized it. The critical reasoning parts of his brain, the questioning parts that would have demanded to know why a knife was being displayed so openly in this room, that part was suffocated under a flood of critical stress neurotransmitters. There was no time to think, only time to act. The prisoner turned his face to Xiaoping, and the confusion of earlier was gone, replaced by a grotesque look of rage. This was the face of a murderer, a man who had killed before and was prepared to kill again. The prisoner swung his knife hand from the side, and Xiaoping instinctively moved inside the arc of the swing, reaching his left hand out to seize the weapon hand of the enraged prisoner. The blade of his own weapon was pointing outward, ready for a thrust, and he acted quickly, plunging the cold steel into the madman's chest and twisting the blade to deliver maximum damage. He could feel the bones and sinews crack and separate as the blade delivered a killing blow, likely severing a major artery. Xiaoping held his enemy's weapon hand in an iron grip without looking at it, as he had been well trained to do in the Commando Airborne Forces more than 2 decades ago. When facing an armed attacker, the eyes told you their intention, and he found that he was now staring into the face of a confused young man, not a murderous savage, but a simple, ordinary youth with no anger or hatred in his eyes. Xiaoping pulled his right hand back, expecting to see that he was gripping a cell phone, but the hateful device was missing. A 7-inch blade slid from the prisoner's chest, and blood began oozing from the open shirt. There was no huge spray of blood, for the poor man's heart was no longer pumping. The knife blade had a few streaks of blood, and some fatty tissue was stuck to the serrated hilt, torn loose as he pulled the blade free. Xiaoping looked at the arm that he held in a now trembling grip, the same arm that he had seen ready to deliver a murderous blow with a deadly weapon. A black cell phone dropped from the loose fingers, falling to the floor. He stepped back, dropping the limp, lifeless arm. The prisoner slouched in the chair, held in place by the leather straps, which were still as intact as they had been when he had first seen the man. A tumult of emotions welled up inside him: confusion, fear, and disgust. The hunchback was waving his arms frantically at General Xiaoping, and he was shouting words, but Xiaoping heard nothing. The adrenaline was still surging through him, and his mind was struggling to register the changes in the situation. He could not feel his hands. They had gone completely cold, and his muscles were locked into position so tightly that the tendons felt ready to snap. He looked at Shizhong. Somehow this weak, pathetic excuse for a military officer was completely calm, the smirk subdued, but still very present on his hateful face. There must have been something terrifying in Xiaoping's face even now, for the overweight staff officer shrunk back when Xiaoping stared him down. He forced himself to look around, seeing shocked and terrified faces, but no one else dared to move. The knife. He still had the knife in his hand, dripping gore and blood all over. He looked at the smeared blade, seeing small reflections of his face in the small parts of the polished blade that were still visible. The prisoner's face was now completely white, and he was obviously stone dead. dead by Chao Ping's hand. Why had he killed him? He struggled to remember the last thing he had seen. The man had been ready to attack, and he had reacted with the finely honed instinct of a well-trained soldier. But what he had seen was a lie, a projection. The cell phone had somehow projected the lie on top of reality, and it had seemed real enough in the moment. The memory of the man's face with the murderous intent, the lack of restraints, and the knife overlaid on top of the other cell phone. A stunning technology indeed. Chao Ping slowly allowed his muscles to relax and carefully placed the knife onto the tray. The cell phone that he had been holding was nowhere to be seen, but that was all right. He hoped it had fallen to the ground and been broken. It may have been evil, but it was really just a tool. The real evil was inside of him, the ability to casually murder a man with a single knife blow. A light nausea began to turn his stomach, but he knew it would pass. Killing someone was an act that repulsed the body, but with training, you could suppress that physical sensation. What would never go away was the stain on a man's soul. Chao Ping knew that he would spend a week praying and fasting for this poor prisoner's spirit, asking God's forgiveness. That was for later, but right now it was time to collect his wits and keep his darker thoughts to himself. He straightened and turned, looking at every single person in their eyes, smiling. "Congratulations." The words broke something, a palpable tension that had been suspended like fog. The men relaxed, and some of them smiled. "This is a formidable breakthrough. You have done well, and you will be well rewarded for your work." These men, and the ones who employed them, were certainly going to be quite wealthy by selling this technology to the government. He imagined them being buried alive in coins. Blood money. The People's Republic will use this technology to pursue peace throughout the world, bringing the full benefit of humankind, and most importantly, to the true Chinese people and our allies. He continued to deliberately drone on for several minutes, making his voice a loud, buzzing monotone. He was quite talented at speaking, but saying nothing at all, for it was the job of generals to give boring speeches. He watched the men in the room losing focus, and he nurtured this, never allowing himself to stop speaking, pulling them off guard with his voice. It was difficult to suppress his emotions under such circumstances, and it was made even more challenging by a headache that seemed to be building behind his eyes. When he felt the timing was right, he concluded the speech and began to stride from the room, beckoning General Shizhong to follow with a nod. He passed under the vent and felt the light draft move across his neck once again as he turned to the right. No one spoke a word to him as he moved through the building, and he needed no direction or guidance. In 3 minutes and 36 seconds, he was once more outside. The muted, cloudy daylight was painful to his dark-adapted eyes, so he opened a pocket of his dress uniform and removed a pair of sunglasses. He buttoned the pocket once again, patting it once it was closed. He donned the glasses and turned to face General Shizhong, who was trailing at a distance. The fat general looked unsettled, and that was good. Chao Ping had put him off guard, but now it was time to use some flattery. "Shifu, you have used your connections well." He used an honorific normally reserved for a student speaking to a teacher. Shizhong heard this and began to smirk again. "There is some paperwork to be done shortly, but we must purchase this technology immediately. It is worth 1,000,000,000,000 yuan for certain, that much I will say." The mention of money was clearly what this man was waiting for. Chao Ping struggled to contain his disgust at the look of greed on the fat man's face. "I require something of you, General, and this is important." The greedy look remained, and Shizhong nodded. "I am at your service. What can I do to expedite this wonderful technology?" Chao Ping paused and stared at him. "This device must remain as secret as humanly possible. No one but us may know of its existence. I will place my own men to guard this wing of the university. But under no circumstances are you to reveal what you have seen here to anyone else, including your own subordinates." Shizhong stared at his superior officer, the tiny smirk returning. I imagine that you would not want the details of your actions to be made public, General. Chowping was stunned for a second as the realization crashed over him. This had been a setup from the beginning, of course, and any old fool should have been able to see it. Any old fool except himself. They had brought him here, tricked him into killing a man, and now they had some leverage over him. It took all of his considerable self-control to restrain the rage that surged through him. He permitted what he hoped was a sardonic smirk to cross his lips. Killing a prisoner? Are you planning to report that to someone? Shizhong looked confused, then a bit angry. They could not reveal the incident without raising more questions, so they would not. It was an empty threat, but the fact that the threat had been made told Chowping that they didn't trust him. Shizhong may even now be planning how to remove him from his position and take his place. It was possible that a plan was already in the works to make that happen. Report to me every detail of any tests that have already been made and any further tests that are planned, General Shizhong, and please have that as quickly as you can. I must make a report to the chairman himself, he said, throwing in a reminder that he had the ear of the most powerful man in the country, the chairman of the party. A light rain was falling as Chowping walked back to the car that was idling in the university square. The drops of rain on the glossy black paint brought an instant flashback of blood drops glistening on a shiny steel surface. He shuddered as he opened the door and took his place in the back, rubbing his forehead as the headache slowly faded. The driver said nothing, perhaps sensing a change in the general's mood. He was a well-disciplined and loyal man, a former member of his old squad. Even this man must not be told anything. No one must know about this device, but a process was now in motion that could not be stopped by him alone. Chowping touched the flap of his uniform where he had stored his sunglasses, feeling the shape of the cell phone within. This was not the cell phone that was issued to him by the army. That device was now sitting on the metal tray that had also contained the knife. The switch had been made during the confusion that followed the prisoner's gruesome death. The evil device that had altered his reality was now in his possession, and it could stay inside that pocket for now, but something had to be done with it soon. He glanced up to the rearview mirror, catching the eyes of his driver. He nodded without saying anything, and the car began to move. Chapter 2. Chowping returned to his home and discovered that his wife of 36 years was out, probably visiting a family member as she often did in the late afternoon. He moved directly to his home office, a room that had once belonged to his only child, the son who had served in the same regiment that he had once commanded. That son was now somewhere in the United States and had stopped talking to his parents for a few years. He closed and locked the door, and for good measure checked every corner of the room, windows, and fixtures for listening devices or bugs. There was no way to know for sure, but he understood that there was a good chance that they were monitoring him. It would not be long until they discovered that the phones had been switched, and so he must act quickly. His personal cell phone was always close to him, so they hopefully could not monitor him through that device. Just in case, he activated a powerful encryption app and turned on the Virtual Private Network, or VPN. Immediately, a new folder appeared on his phone's home screen, which contained a social media application that was forbidden for government officials to use, but which he had been using for quite some time. The gray logo flashed, and his feed appeared. He had just one chance to contact a certain eccentric billionaire, the owner of this social media platform. Ike Zippor was famous and eccentric, much like his uncle had been before his death. He was also an honorable man, pushing for free speech and continuing to develop the glorious space technology that would someday carry humans into other worlds. There was a good chance that the act of contacting Ike Zippor would doom him and his wife to imprisonment, and maybe even execution. The thought of his wife being strapped to a chair in a dark room should have brought fear. But instead, he felt a surge of anger so powerful that he actually saw red flashes in his peripheral vision. He punched the screen, typing a personal message in the best English he was capable of mustering, directly to the one person who might know what to do with this technology. He prayed that the message would be seen and that something could be done before he was found and arrested. He powered down the device and placed it back into the metal case that he had purchased some weeks back. The metal would block most signals to and from the device, and possibly grant him the ability to flee somewhere without being found. It took about 15 minutes for Xiaoping to dress in the most nondescript civilian clothing he could find and pack a small bag with the bare essentials to last a few days. He carefully replaced his uniform in the same place he always did. If someone came searching, no clues must be left behind, no indication of where he had gone. A very small leather-bound book was hidden under his mattress, and he tucked that book under his shirt and into his waistband. The bulge of the book would not be visible, and it was much safer to keep this particular book on his person. Before leaving the room, he touched his wife's pillow and felt a powerful sadness, almost making him weep. He prayed under his breath that no harm would come to his beloved partner, but he could not protect her by remaining in this place. If God wanted to save her, he would, but if not, he would see her in the next life. He immediately knew where he needed to go, and it was about a 40-minute walk from where he was now, although he would need to take longer to ensure that he was not being followed or tracked. With cold resolution, he closed and locked the door of his home for the very last time in his life and began to walk in the cool April air. Chapter 3. Damian Weber stood at the entrance of the hotel, staring at the dilapidated wooden Chinese letters hanging above the doorway. This can't possibly be the right place, he thought, glancing at his watch. It was barely a 2-star hotel, and that was by Chinese standards. He supposed it was good cover if nothing else. He opened the door to walk inside, and immediately another man came in from the gloomy day, following right behind him. Damian was used to keeping track of people without alerting them to that fact, and he tracked the movements of the man as he walked towards the elevator. All he had was a room number, but that was all he needed. He punched the button for the elevator and took a quick glance at the man who was right behind him. He was surprised to see that it was another American, and the man made no attempt to hide the fact that he was staring at Damian. Damian gave a polite nod back and tried to pretend that he didn't notice him, but the man continued to stare as they waited for the elevator. The door opened, and the two men stepped inside. Damian tensed, but the other man appeared to be relaxed. "Hey," he said, "billionaires, right?" The man shook his head, his medium-length stringy hair flopping about. Damian was uncharacteristically startled. "Excuse me?" he said, not sure if he heard the man correctly. The man smiled, and Damian saw that he was scrawny, almost gaunt, and was missing one of his front teeth. His face was leathery, but the weathering appeared to be mostly on one side of his face, as if he had been tanning on just that side for decades. Damian observed all of this in a fraction of a second, while he decided what to do about the apparent stranger who seemed to know exactly what he was doing here. "Hey man, sorry. I didn't mean to startle you or nothing. Just kinda happy to see another American here, you know?" Damian nodded slowly but said nothing, still tense and wary. "I kinda knew you were on the team when you showed up looking at your watch at exactly 6, huh?" The man let out a guffaw. Damian swore under his breath. Looking at his watch had been an obvious lapse. He had gotten soft during his contract at the embassy. He wasn't really trained for undercover stuff. His preference would have been to go into this mission with guns blazing. The ragged-looking man stuck out his hand, and Damian saw that his fingernails were yellow with nicotine. "I'm Randy." The man was effusive, and Damian found himself shaking the proffered hand. "It's a good thing you're on my team, Randy, or I'd have to kill you right here in this elevator," Damian said, not joking in the slightest. Randy made a mock gesture of surprise and chuckled again. "Oh yeah, I know you're definitely a spook. Don't worry, I won't get on your bad side, brother." He lightly tapped Damian playfully on the arm. "No, I'm not a—" The door opened before Damian could finish the sentence and tell the man that he wasn't a government agent anymore. But was that actually true? He still worked at the embassy, and his security clearance was still intact. He had left official government employment as an Army Ranger more than 4 years ago now, after the years of massive inflation had rendered his paycheck utterly worthless. The humiliation of having his car repossessed was the final straw, and he had been nursing a grudge against the government ever since. The hallways of the ancient hotel were worn, but clean, and Damien carefully eased himself out of the elevator, feeling a surge of adrenaline and also excitement. The message he had gotten on social media from the reclusive billionaire named Ike Zippor had been accompanied by a massive payment of crypto, enough to live quite nicely for 5 years, and all he needed to do was retrieve something that was well guarded. The promised payoff was 10 times the amount of crypto that had already been sent to his account. It was worth tens of millions of US dollars by his estimate, but unlike dollars, you could actually spend crypto in China through the extensive black market apps that included free drone delivery. Damien was under no illusions about what retrieve meant. This was a straight-up theft mission. The crypto had won him over, and he immediately sent half of it to his mother. The rest he had downloaded to a wallet chip that was hidden in a golden cross necklace, which itself was a gift from his mother. The doors of hotel rooms were spaced evenly along the hallway, and at the far end, a brown-skinned man with a pleasant round face sat in a chair in front of one of these doors, his arms crossed and his eyes closed. Damien approached the man, who opened his eyes and gave a small half-smile. "Welcome to Grand Theft Billionaire," he said, a tiny smirk on his tanned face. The light Hispanic accent was barely noticeable. "I know you," Damien said, the memories from years ago tickling his brain. He had met this guy somewhere, but the memory was just out of reach. "Emmanuel Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno, Maria de los Remedios Melendez?" He said it without missing a breath, grinning as he watched Damien's reaction. "Just call me Manny." Damien let out a laugh. "Yeah, let's stick with that." Manny looked him up and down and declared, "You've gained weight, LT. That was it." This guy had been a ranger, and now he remembered the man. When Damien had first joined the 75th as a new Scrolled Ranger second lieutenant, Emmanuel Melendez had been a first sergeant in charge of the Regimental Reconnaissance Division, a highly specialized team of men whose job was infiltration and reconnaissance. Even among the Rangers, these were highly respected soldiers, and Damien had immediately tried to apply to the RRD team. "I can't believe you're here. Small world, right?" Manny smiled and shrugged. "It's even smaller than you think. Who do you think recommended you to our wealthy friend?" Damien was taken aback. No one from the regiment should have known where he was. He had taken great pains to try and cut ties with the army after leaving. "How did you know I was out here?" He tried not to sound angry. The reply was another one of Emmanuel's famous shrugs. "Let's take this inside." Emmanuel nodded, and they entered the hotel room. Randy was already whispering theatrically with a tall, thin Chinese man who wore a perpetually terrified expression on his face. "Cool, we got a quartet here," Randy started saying, but the Chinese man seized his arm and held his finger to his lips. Definitely paranoid, but Damien was beginning to think that paranoia might be the better option for this little operation. "Whisper, please." The man gestured around to the walls and the lone window, which was covered in dusty sheer curtains. "Okay, yeah, we can whisper." Randy adopted a louder-than-necessary stage whisper. The Chinese man beckoned them to come close, and they gathered in a small huddle. Damien glanced at Manny, and the other man nodded, coming in beside him. The Chinese man rubbed his face vigorously and grimaced. "I am called Wei. That is not my name, but use it, please. The government has created something, a weapon of great power." Damien rolled his eyes, but Randy looked interested. "It is not far from here at the University of Technology." He looked around at them, perhaps hoping for some kind of reaction. "We need to get it. Take it tonight. It's very important." No one said anything, but Randy took a deep breath. "What is it, brother?" he questioned. The Chinese man held his hand to his forehead and sighed. "I don't know." He didn't say what it was, but he was very scared when he came to my house. The last words were barely audible, and they strained to hear him. Damien shook his head and snorted. "This is just a corporate theft. Our rich Dutch billionaire just wants his company to own some valuable technology." Randy nodded and smiled. "Yeah, sounds like it. Count me in." Manny looked pointedly at him, his eyes narrowed. Then he smiled his small, lopsided smile. "Oh, see. I remember now. You are the one who stole the latest Apple phone before they unveiled it on the live stream." He snapped his fingers. Randy grinned even wider. "Heck yes, brother. That's why I'm here. I'm the best thief in the world." His voice was now a bit louder than a normal speaking volume, and Wei was frantically waving his hand, looking more panicked than ever. "No, no, no thief, no steal." His whisper was barely a croak. Damien and Randy both laughed again. Emmanuel held his hand palm out in the middle of the huddle, and the laughter died. He looked calmly at the other two men, and then nodded to the Chinese man to continue. Wei was struggling to calm himself, and it didn't seem to be working. He labored to speak, but the words wouldn't come. At last, he sat on the small twin bed and spoke in his croaky whisper. "This device will be used to destroy your country." Damien looked at Manny and saw his eyes widen. The hair on his neck stood on end, and he felt the laughter and frivolity drain from him. "The man who told me of it will be arrested soon. He is hiding now, but they always find the one who hides. The computer tells them where to look." He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. "They will arrest me next. They will torture us and put our families in prison. We may be killed, or we may simply be punished." He spoke these words with less anxiety than before. "It is already going to happen. Nothing can stop that. You must take this technology back to America and find a way to disable it. Do not give it to your government. They will use it for evil just as our government will." "Yeah, sounds about right." Damien couldn't help himself. Randy was already pacing the room, muttering to himself, his graying hair flopping around his sweating forehead. "I know why he's here." Damien pointed at Randy, who was lighting a cigarette and fingering the curtains. "I know why I'm here. I'm the handsome security." No one laughed at that. "All right, Wei is the inside man, but what's your role here, Melendez?" Emmanuel pursed his lips and appeared to think for a moment. "I'm the cook. No one makes better tamales than I do." He winked at Wei, who looked utterly baffled. Manny shrugged. "I was invited by Ike Zippor. He asked me to come as a personal favor to him." "Do you know him then?" Damien was curious. "A friend of a friend kind of thing." He shrugged again. "Making friends with Dutch billionaires is not something I would have expected of a retired ranger, but I think maybe that's not the only job you've had." Manny smiled his little smile and said nothing. Wei pulled his phone out of his pocket and waved his hand as before to try to get their attention. 10 minutes, he said. Damien took a deep breath and glanced at Emmanuel, who nodded back to him. The planning session took less than 5 minutes because the plan was startlingly simple. The University of Technology had a serious security flaw that Wei explained to them in stilted English. The ventilation system provided access to the very room that they were seeking, and would allow them to bypass the multiple layers of checkpoints and security gates, including getting inside the building itself. The most difficult part would be to get inside the room and take the device, since the door was coated with a proximity lock and was probably guarded by armed men. Damien had mentioned some possible problems that they might come across, including sensors that might be installed in the ventilation system and the fact that it would be noisy to be crawling inside a metal tube. At this, Wei shook his head and opened a small satchel to produce some fairly large silk towels, which he handed out to each of them. He mimed lying on the towel and sliding, and Damien marveled at the ingenuity. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than getting their clothes dirty inside the filthy vents. The hotel was about 4 blocks from the university, but Wei opened the small hotel window and pointed down to what looked like a metal grate that was set into the sidewalk. A light rain was falling on the dark city, and some of the runoff was probably running under that grate. Damien was not terribly excited about the prospect of stomping through dirty Changchun sewer systems, but no one else seemed to care, so he kept his feelings to himself. They split into 2 teams. Wei took a piece of paper and drew a crude map from memory, giving it to Damien and Randy. Emmanuel and Wei took the lead and descended to ground level in the elevator. "Come on, we're taking the stairs." Damien wasn't going to risk getting stuck in an elevator, and he led them to the fire exit on the exterior of this particular building. "I'll meet you at the bottom. You go ahead." Randy gripped the edge of the emergency exit door, his knuckles turning white. Damien reached back and grabbed the man's loose shirt, hauling him through the open door. "Nope, not risking it." It was just 4 stories, but Randy grumbled under his breath all the way down. At the bottom, Damien turned to him and gripped his upper arm tightly. "Listen, Randy, we're 2 white guys outside at night in a country that doesn't really like Americans, so can you please shut your pie hole?" Randy looked around, perhaps just realizing that they were out in the open. He nodded, and they crossed the street to the grate, which Damien could see had several hinged openings. None of them appeared to be locked, and one of them was slightly ajar. He looked around, but they appeared to be alone on this particular section of street. Cars passed by on the adjacent road, and there would definitely be cops out here, maybe even military patrols. Damien yanked the grate open and was surprised that it was nearly noiseless. He gently prodded Randy into the opening and watched the man descend a tiny metal ladder set into the wall before he jumped into the opening, pulling the gate closed behind himself. He grabbed the other man by the shirt once again, pushing him ahead quickly. They needed to get out of sight in case someone had seen them enter the storm drains. The map was crudely drawn, but accurate, and they splashed their way through several inches of disgusting water for nearly 100 yards, taking a number of turns. Dim light from evenly placed grates like the one they had entered allowed them to navigate easily, but soon they found that there was no more light to be had, and Damien was forced to use his phone's light to make it the final 50 or so yards. He switched the light off and eased around the final corner, hoping to find Emmanuel and Wei rather than armed Chinese military guards. A quiet tapping came from the blackness of the final tunnel, and Damien cautiously moved forward, one hand extended to avoid hitting anything, and the other gripping a small folding knife that was the only weapon he possessed at that moment. He sensed them before he saw them, and stopped. Manny snapped on a lighter, the tiny flame throwing muted shadows on the cement wall of the storm drain, which no longer had any water at the bottom. "Any trouble?" he asked. Damien shook his head. "Nothing we can't handle," he replied, glancing at Randy. Randy paid no attention, instead running his nicotine-stained fingers over the rust-spotted metal door in front of them. The surface had once been painted, but it was so old that almost none of the paint remained. Wei looked terrified, and Damien felt the familiar adrenaline rush of running into a fight. Automatically, he slowed his breathing, forcing himself to calm down and reducing his heart rate. A rustling sound echoed in the tiny cement tunnel, and the heavy metal door swung open. Randy was pushing on the side of it, and this somehow negated most of the inevitable rusty screeching that you would expect. The 4 of them squeezed through the partially open door and climbed a ladder that took them about 25 feet straight up. Damien knew that they had to be inside a building, at least at second-floor height. A series of small passageways covered with plastic grates branched out from this section, and Randy once more led the way, carefully removing the tabs of the grate and placing it on a recess above their heads. They would need to exit by the same passage, so it was important to not leave anything that would slow them down. The small passageways were the ductwork of the building, and as Damien slithered in behind Randy, he could feel the thin metal flex beneath his arms and legs. They would need to spread out to avoid having the tubes collapse. He turned around to Emmanuel Melendez, who was right behind him. "Leave about 10 feet between. These ducts are not strong," he whispered. Manny frowned and nodded, looking back at Wei, who was fumbling with his silk towel. The crawl through the ductwork was excruciatingly slow, and Damien felt his mouth and nose filling with the fine dust that coated every surface as they made their way through the small square tubes. Several times they had to pause as the noise of voices and footsteps echoed from under them, and Damien pictured the metal tubes collapsing at just the wrong moment, sending them plunging into the arms of Chinese soldiers. Finally, Randy waved back at him and motioned to his right. A faint light could be seen from a branch in the ductwork, and Damien watched as Randy peered through the plastic grate covering a large opening in the floor of the ductwork. He lifted it up slowly and pushed it ahead of them, carefully peeking his head down for a look. As he glanced back, he gave a grinning thumbs up and vanished into the hallway below. It took Damien just a few seconds to lower himself into the hallway, and immediately he took a position at the far end, his knife gripped against his wrist, ready for deployment. He could still feel the disgusting sensation of dust clogging his nose, and he had to repress the urge to sneeze. Emmanuel and Wei exited the ductwork, with Manny catching Wei and lowering him to the ground. Both of them were coated in dust, particularly on their faces, and Damien suspected that he looked quite the same. Randy was already working on a door that had been directly below the opening, examining a red glowing card reader that was mounted on the wall. Damien touched Emmanuel and motioned to the far end of the small hallway, communicating without words that he should be the sentry on that side. They waited for several minutes while Randy muttered and cursed under his breath, and Damien could hear plastic breaking behind him along with soft scraping noises. At last, a loud click echoed through the hallway, and the door was unlocked. They hurried inside and closed the door again behind them. The light was still red, which should fool any guards that passed by as long as they didn't peer through the small window. Randy shoved a piece of cardboard against the door magnet to keep it from actually closing. Damien was beginning to see how talented this guy was at his craft. He would never have thought of that. The room was large. If it had still been a classroom, it would have been able to accommodate at least 60 students. It looked like a jumble of machines, computers, and wires, and Damien felt a sense of urgency and desperation. It would take time to search this, time that was in very short supply. He began to root through drawers, cabinets, and benches, looking for anything that appeared unusual. Wei pulled on his sleeve and pointed to a tiny metal box that was mounted just inside a much larger metal cage, spanning floor to ceiling. They both looked to be made of the same type of mesh, and Damien realized that it was a Faraday cage, designed to block electromagnetic signals from coming or going. They all shuffled into the large cage, leaving the door open, and stared at the smaller box for a few seconds. No one wanted to be the first to touch it, but at last, Manny grabbed a deadly-looking knife off a nearby tray and flipped up the latches with the end of the blade. A small door swung open to reveal a single ordinary cell phone. Strange flashes of light began to appear in Damien's vision, fading like shooting stars. He rubbed his eyes again, assuming that it was dust from the vent shaft, but the flashes of light were even more visible when his eyes were closed. The tiny stirrings of a headache began to form behind his eyes. The hair on the back of his neck also began to stand on end, and his well-tuned sense of danger was shouting a warning about the contents of that cage. Without taking any precautions, Wei reached into the cage and grabbed the phone, pulling it out of the box. Nothing happened, although Damien sensed the tension rising rapidly. "Is anyone seeing, like, shooting stars or something?" Randy croaked in his smoke-ravaged whisper. Manny nodded and appeared to be blinking rapidly. Wei was fumbling with the phone, and Manny reached out to seize his hand, only he was too late. The device lit up, the screen almost intolerably bright in the night-dimmed room. He gasped and turned his head to an empty chair that was bolted to the floor. Leather restraints were dangling from the arms, and tiny black spots could be seen on the leather padding of the seat and back. Wei was frozen for a split second, then staggered backward, nearly knocking Randy over. Damien caught the man, and in doing so, his hand brushed the cell phone. An apparition appeared in the chair, a man seated with his eyes closed, popping into existence right in front of him. His breath caught in his throat, but it got worse almost immediately. The man opened his eyes and stared at him for a split second, before thrusting out with a large knife that apparently had been in his hand. Damien let out a cry and reached for his own knife. As his hand moved away from the cell phone, the apparition began to fade, leaving nothing except the empty chair. It's a hallucination, he realized. It had felt real, vivid, and corporeal. The man's face twisted in anger and the light from overhead reflecting off the knife. Wei dropped the phone on the tray, trembling visibly. Emmanuel spoke in a low whisper. "You saw something, didn't you?" Damien nodded. "It projects a picture of a man sitting in that chair, holding a knife." "I could see it, everything. It looked so real, I was ready to start fighting. He rubbed his eyes hard enough to make stars appear in his vision. The streaks of light had slowed somewhat, but were still visible on the periphery of his vision. Forget the mind link. This is way more advanced. He was referring to a wearable device that could read some simple thoughts and was controllable by the wearer's eye movements and blinking patterns. The company that had invented that device was owned by the same man who was responsible for putting them in this room. As soon as I touched it, I saw the projection, but it slowly faded when my hand was no longer in direct contact with that. He was looking at the tray, where the phone was now sitting. The screen was once more dark, but the impact of that projection was still echoing in his mind. They all understood now. This was powerful technology, something that could be used in 1,000 different ways, most of them evil. The ability to project a specific vision to a person through a device that seemed to be a normal-looking cell phone was more powerful than a nuclear weapon. The fact that it was being developed by the Chinese was all the more concerning. They would certainly be weaponizing this, and with tensions between the United States and China at an all-time high, this could be the very thing to throw the planet into a nuclear war. Take it. Wei's voice was just a whisper. Damien pulled out the silk towel, which was now streaked with dust across its velvety maroon surface. He winced a bit as he wrapped the phone in the soft cloth, expecting to see the apparition reappear in the chair, but nothing happened. He shoved the phone into a pocket and zipped it shut. It was as secure as he could make it, and hopefully, the cloth would prevent him from being haunted by any further projections. Okay, now His voice trailed off. The door of the room pushed open with a soft click, and the four of them scattered, trying to hide in the deepest shadows of the room. Damien could not see through the doorway, but a face appeared in the small window. A short man in a dark, snug-fitting black cap peered past the door, scanning the room. His dark eyes were wide, and his mouth was open. He looked utterly terrified, and Damien understood why. It was unlikely that the guards knew what was actually in this room, although they would surely have some suspicions. The man shuffled further into the room, but he was still behind the door, and Damien felt like he could probably approach without being seen. He quickly moved to the door, preparing to use the heavy object as a battering ram against the guard. Not fast enough. The man was now in front of the door and saw Damien approaching. His face went from terror to anger in a second, and the barrel of a pistol appeared in his hand. There was no time and no cover. Damien dodged to his right, a last-second attempt to get out of the kill zone of the first shot. The blast of the pistol was deafening in the small room, and Damien hit the floor, going prone by instinct. The man was no longer there. His entire body had simply vanished backward. The pistol spun as it flew from his hand, and there was a crash in the darkness from the far side of the room as his body was slammed into a bank of equipment. Emmanuel's face was the only thing he could see, half lit by the hallway lights through the open door. While Damien had been spotted, Manny had taken the guard out from behind. Damien rose to his feet, feeling himself for a gunshot wound, and was amazed to find that he was completely unhurt. The pistol was out of sight, unretrievable in the dark. The four of them scrambled through the door into the hallway, and Wei slammed the door shut. The lock engaged, and the light showed red, so their attacker was hopefully locked inside, although that was not a certainty at all. Unless that lone guard was the only person in the building, the single gunshot would have been heard by someone, and they would be coming very soon.